First of all, many thanks that you agreed to share some thoughts with us and with the Bulgarian public, because it's you personally, for me, you are one of the people that let's put it that way, that inspired me in the field of developmental biology.
Oh, well, that's very kind of you. That's gonna make an Irishman, blush. My color is gonna change now. So yeah.
Yeah, but the real reason I just want to start with this one. The real reason that we are together is that finally we have in hardcover your book from
Beautiful.
2007. Yes, endless forms, most beautiful. Translated not by me, but I'm a scientific redactor of it, editor. So if there is any mistake, you know who to blame.
I'm not gonna catch them, as you know. So
Yeah.
yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So my first question, because as a kid I used to read Conan Doyle, and he has a nice book, not about Sherlock Holmes, but about scientists. And of course, the book, and there is a certain character there, Professor Challenger, who is very much against the very idea that scientists should waste their time for popularizing science. So there is a famous place in which he said, "Okay, don't make this mistake, Professor Wardley. With all my respect, he's just like a parasite. He well, he used the efforts and everything that the researchers do in order to gain some popularity. But I myself am a popularizer of science, of course, not in that scale. So, what's your opinion on that? Should we waste our time on yes, on making popular interviews, books, films? By the way, I just saw that you have a film from 2022 that I didn't watch. By the way,
Well, no, yeah, I see the role of science in our culture and global culture, right? And science, if I may say, I think science comes closest to maybe the ideals of the United Nations of almost any human endeavor. Here we are speaking, right? We're from totally different backgrounds. We know that there's norms of how scientists engage with each other around the world, about how we collaborate, about how we share information, things like this. And so I think the scientific world has a lot to offer society in general, both understanding, how scientists think, how scientists work together. It's actually a pretty happy story, most of the time, right? And then what we find out, and I think in terms of our culture, the whole adventure of exploring nature and of revealing, some of how nature works. That's things that society can enjoy, I think, and can get some meaning out of. So I think science has a lot to contribute to culture, much as art or music or literature does. And it can only make that contribution to culture if you actively make the effort to bring those insights, bring those discoveries, into the culture, which is generally going to be through media, right? It's going to be through books and podcasts and movies and things like this. And there's that I would think is maybe the more idealistic view of what science can do for culture. But there's, I think, a very practical view, which is in most countries, the public supports science. So to have that public support, the public should in return understand what scientists are doing, why they're doing it, what they're finding out, how that might impact their lives. And scientists have to be part of that conversation. It can't be left to just third parties. We have unique insights because we're the adventurers, right? We're the ones that journey into the unknown and see things that haven't been seen before and think things that haven't been thought before. So, of course, we should be involved in communicating that.
Okay, great answer. Usually, I when somebody has to rationalize, because that's quite an effort. You should spare some time to think how you can, for instance, how you deliver to the public the concept for Hox genes.
Yeah.
I'm not wearing it now, but I have a T-shirt with a Drosophila and a question that pops up out of her head, and an inscription which says "What the Hawks." So
yeah.
usually people start and the process of rationalization, like okay, we as a scientist should be involved in public communication in order to convince people to give money, but yeah, that's only one of the reasons, and you put it very well. Our role is also to bring to the attention of the general public that science is equal as equal part of the equation to the contribution of the humanity, as well as the arts and also literature and something like that. Okay, so back to your book. So in endless forms, most beautiful, and once again, what a title! It's like, of course,
I stole it from Darwin. I mean,
Credit goes to Darwin, but Steinbeck did the same. So Hemingway did the same, but with the Bible. So you literally had a great example.
Yeah.
So you emphasize the role of gene regulation over gene invention. How did this shift change our understanding of evolution compared to earlier gene-centric views?
Yeah, I think I was lucky enough to be part of sort of a revolutionary change in thinking, but that revolutionary change in thinking came because we actually were able to get answers to some questions. And when I was a graduate student, or maybe just as I was beginning to be a graduate student, none of these genes involved in bodybuilding and body patterning had been isolated. And I was just hearing rumors, and you had to go around and talk to some people. But the expectation at that time, and because I was getting my PhD in immunology, and that was generally studying, mammals, furry animals. The expectation was that the making of a mouse or a human and the making of a fruit fly would have nothing in common, right? These were entirely different branches of the animal kingdom, and we have bones and flies don't, and and we have big brains and they don't, etc. So when the first genes were isolated that were involved in so-called Hox genes, and then they were quickly found to have counterparts across the entire animal kingdom, including you and I, and to be arranged in clusters like we saw them in fruit flies. This really was shocking. It was exciting. It was thrilling, but it was shocking, and it caused a complete rethink. And I would say no one I know, or no one I know of, has claimed to have predicted that result. That no biologist saw it coming. That a similar set of genes would govern the building of animals as different as worms and flies and humans and elephants. And then that forces you to think, well, what does that mean then? If we find that there's some genes in common in bodybuilding, what does that tell you? And the first inference you'd make is a lot of the animal kingdom has been constructed using a similar, we say, sort of toolkit of genes. So you're kind of you're kind of making this sort of really big conceptual turn from thinking that they had nothing in common to now realizing they have something in common. But nonetheless, we are different animals from fruit flies, and butterflies are different from fruit flies, and lobsters are different than shrimp and all that. So you still say, well, what makes them different if you have similar sets of genes? And then that's really one of the, I think maybe one of the principal discoveries of Evo Devo was that these genes are shared. But the second thought then is, okay, well then how do you make different types of animals? And you make different types of animals by using these genes in different ways. And much as the way you use tools in different ways, and you make different, constructs in your carpentry shop. So that's how I don't know if I'm quite on the nose to your question, but the big change of thinking was prompted by shocking discoveries that led us to say, well, if the genes are going to be so similar, then how do you get diversity? And you get diversity by using them in different ways, expressing them in different ways.
Yeah, about that, because of course, you have cited this great thought of Theodosius Dobzhansky that, and I also do in my lectures, I emphasize on that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. So, speaking of evolution, many people still think that evolution works mainly through mutations in protein coding genes.
Yeah.
So, why is gene regulation such a critical piece of the puzzle? Because I'll put aside this part of people, so this group of people that think that evolution is something in which you can believe or not. We are not going to speak about them.
No. Yeah. Well, so yes, why the importance of regulation? Well, this part of this is the historical explanation of this, is that for the longest time in reading DNA, the parts of the DNA we could read were that were decoded into proteins. We deciphered the genetic code in the 1960s. When biologists grind up cells and tissues, or they analyze blood, they're usually looking at proteins. And so they look at how proteins are encoded in the DNA. So we had a very protein-centric picture of life. But we hadn't addressed sort of the choreography of all this. And so let me sort of start back. And I think, and maybe, listeners or readers don't start with this bias, but imagine this, that you're going to go from a single fertilized egg, a single cell, to, depending upon the creature, up to trillions of cells, right, that are differentiated into hundreds of different types and organized into tissues and organs, et cetera. Where does that choreography come from? And it's a ballet of time and space. Events have to happen in a certain order, and they happen in a certain relative space one to each other. And so that information's in the genome. It's in the DNA, right? But it has to unfold. And that's what regulation is. Regulation is determining where in time and space genes are active or inactive. And that's the choreography that one needs to build a complex creature. So the way I try to boil it down, the relationship is to think about development. Development is, of course, one of the most spectacular things that happens on our planet. A single cell becoming a complex creature. And anyone who's a parent, can really appreciate this. If you've been through that experience, it is just sort of amazing. And there's no end to that.
By the way, I have in my thermostat now few chicken embryos, but I'm not going to show them because it will be broadcasted, this interview, and I am performing an ex ovo experiment.
Okay, that's great. That's great.
With my students, so to evaluate the oxidative stress and et cetera, et cetera. But yeah. Still, because since the time of Aristotle, people have thought, whoa, how can in 21 days you can observe every day the development of a chicken? And but what was the difference? Because Aristotle just had the power to observe, and so he said, okay, I'm going to crack this egg every day. So I'm going to crack it on first day, second day, later. And he came up with this idea of preformation.
Yeah.
Okay. But now we have the tools. Now we have a modern labs, and now our understanding of these processes is very, very evolved from this time.
Exactly. And what the developmental biologists of the 1980s, and I was one of them, they enjoyed, but we were making the kind of images that's part of your backdrop, which is we were able to go in and look at embryos moment by moment and see the chemical changes that were taking place in embryos before the physical changes
Yeah.
that we would see with the eye or see in a microscope that was the making of a particular tissue or the making of a particular appendage or whatever it might be. So we understood there was all of this genetic activity going on that foreshadowed the making of, you know, body parts and tissues and things like this. So there would be no evolution of development. There would be no evo-devo without the devo. The devo was a huge revolution in biology, and now understanding how complex creatures are constructed. But once you understand that there's this choreography, it's a small, well, hopefully it's not too large a step to understand that physical differences in creatures come about through changes in that process. A little tinkering over here, a little change over there. You make something a little larger, something a little smaller. You start building something a little sooner. You put it in a different place. All these things are changes that happen during development that give us the diversity of creatures that we see out in the world. So development and evolution are closely intertwined because development is the making of an individual, and the evolution is the emergence of all these different kinds of things by modifying that developmental program. And so all this is about regulation because there's so much in common to what animals have genetically, but how they use them in building things in time and space, that's where the real differences lie.
And that brings me to the next question. So evo-devo, a very complex field which bridges together genetics, embryology, evolution. What were the biggest challenges in integrating these fields into a cohesive discipline? Because now I'm working in the field of astrobiology. That's my, let's say, last effort. I'm the director of our master program of astrobiology. Astrobiology, you know, it's a huge field with a lot of interconnecting disciplines, and I face a lot of, let's say, tension in order to put the efforts of our team in one direction or at least three directions.
Yeah. Well, I think, as you mentioned, evo-devo does bring together different disciplines. So certainly developmental biology, or embryology as we call it, genetics, because, you know, genes are the things that change and do the work, right, through time and space. And evolutionary biology writ large, like some of the most enthusiastic people for evo-devo were paleontologists. Because paleontologists can see this deep history of life, right? And say, you know, we know, birds evolved from dinosaurs. We know the history of mammals, et cetera, et cetera. And what the new evo-devo gave us were ways to actually ask about the origins of structures, the origins of these creatures. So, you know, how did a fish fin become a walking limb, right? So we know from the paleontology that happened. But now we can understand from evo-devo by comparing what happens in different creatures that make fins, creatures that make limbs, what's the same and what's different. So that integration meant paleontology was integrated. That meant that what you would sort of call population genetics, which is more about variation that exists in populations. So evolution is, you know, enormous in its scale because it considers things going on moment by moment in the world, but also considers, you know, the 3.8 billion year history of life. And so evo-devo steps in and says, well, how have differences come about between creatures? How do you get a new structure? How do you paint a spot on a butterfly, right? How do you change limb number in a caterpillar or in a shrimp? And, you know, evolution prior to this sort of breakthrough of evo-devo, we couldn't answer that question because we had no idea how animal forms or plant forms were made, right? We were just spectators to this incredible pageant watching development, but we didn't know what was going on the inside. So of course we didn't know what precise changes happened to give us different kinds of creatures or to give us different structures. So very integrative. And I think that I got to circle back on this. You know, this has a huge aesthetic element. You know, people love nature. If you love flowers, well, the evolution of flowers is interesting. If you love animals, well, the evolution of animals is interesting. And I think evo-devo allows you to tap into that sort of love of nature, that love of diversity, because you're seeking an explanation for how that diversity came about. And and there was a very strong aesthetic dimension to this work because watching embryos develop, it's beautiful, right? And the images you have behind you, I mean, it's a beautiful image. And I think that drew a lot of talent into the world. In other words, in the early 1980s, it wasn't clear that Evo Diva, it didn't even have that name. It wasn't clear that this line of research was going to explode. But once it started to find out really exciting things and seemed that more and more questions were accessible, it drew a lot of talented people from very different fields who were like, I want to understand, the making and diversity of the animal kingdom. Well, that's going to integrate viewpoints and expertise from lots of different areas.
Yeah, because you mentioned paleontology, so why certain forms never arise despite seeming possible? I wonder because a lot of science fiction, a lot of non-scientific fiction. So, like, why we don't see animals with wheels? Or birds, birds using some quadricopters instead of wings. And why, for instance, we don't have six-legged mammals?
Yeah.
Also, we have hexapods, but why don't we have six-legged mammals? And that's one of the questions that boggles the minds of young zoologists. Let's put it that way.
But we can have a lot more fun. Those questions were around 40 or 50 years ago. But we can have a lot more fun with them now because, we understand more about the program that, makes these structures. And you can start to say, okay, well, why don't you have a six-legged animal? Well, let me see. Could you modify things in such a way? And you sort of think it just may be too hard to get from 4 to 6. It's probably not that hard to get from 6 to 4 or to get from 8 to 4 or even to get from 12 to 4. But to get from 4 to 6, given all the other stuff that you're trying to make, maybe you just can't go there. But then you look at things and you say among the mammals, look at the evolution of aquatic mammals, right, from terrestrial ancestors. I mean, that's pretty amazing, right? So, four-legged animals evolved from fish. So fish came to land to give rise to four-legged animals, and four-legged animals have gone back to the water in the form of aquatic mammals. Well, that's not your six-legged animal, but that's still pretty stunning, remarkable stuff. So I guess you can choose, you can have fun studying what has happened, and you can have fun imagining what didn't happen and why. Yeah.
No, because apparently you can use, for instance, chicken embryos.
Yeah.
You can simply put a bit of FGF8, and you'll receive another apical ridge zone. In the middle between the limb and the wing. So you can make a lot of crazy stuff, but that didn't happen in nature. So so for some reasons.
Yeah.
So
they may not compete that well with the other four-legged creatures or other winged creatures out there. But and I think it gives us some sense that there's a lot of potential there. What avenues get explored, is determined by many factors. But what the paleontologists also tell us is the pretty extraordinary creatures have existed in the past. No one would believe that things such as dinosaurs could exist if our hillsides weren't littered with them, right? An amazing array of creatures, enormous creatures, and things like this. And so, there's lots and lots of wonderful things that aren't around anymore. Maybe
the sheer amount of what we fail to understand is the sheer amount of species that have been perished and that we don't have a count on them because they didn't left us with fossil remains.
That's right.
We simply don't know.
I love Darwin's early description, that the crust of the earth is a vast museum of which, little has been explored and little has been, retained. Nonetheless, whether it's from Darwin's era or much later, what paleontologists have unearthed has certainly taught us a lot about the history of life and the history of our own species. The great thing is that there's many more fossils still to be discovered. I still think it's a golden age of paleontology, but it's hard work. It's hard work to find new things. Yeah.
Yeah. And speaking of modern tools like, for instance, CRISPR or prime editing, which comes already in our hands, how do you see experimental evolving in the next decade? So we're on the bridge of a very interesting era.
Yeah. Well, I think, I mean, let's just take CRISPR for an example. It was so this ability to make very precise genetic changes. It's a very powerful way to test our hypotheses about things that have happened. And sort of some of my favorite applications. There's this beautiful puzzle in nature, discovered by a contemporary of Darwin, discovered by Henry Walter Bates, referred to as mimicry or Batesian mimicry. And this is where an unrelated species independently resembles another species. And that's because of selective pressures in the environment to look similarly. And this might be, for example, butterflies that resemble each other. And mimicry, it's a spectacular phenomenon, and you can find it all over the world. But the butterfly mimicry is sort of a special case. It's spectacular. It's kind of how it was first discovered with Bates. And it was once CRISPR came about, our ideas about mimicry became instantly accessible with experimental tools. As people had some leads to the genes that were involved, now people working on, for example, butterfly wing patterns can manipulate those patterns on a daily basis using like CRISPR tools. So beautiful and important evolutionary questions are accessible because of these tools. And there's lots and lots of clever people both using those tools and inventing and modifying new ones. So I think there are certain puzzles in evolution, the origin of structures, things like mimicry, that are hard to get at, but these genetic tools, the precision of these genetic tools, allow us to manipulate things and to test hypotheses very, very with pretty high precision. And so I think that's what I see is coming in the next years. Is I think a lot. The other thing I would say about these genetic tools is they allow us to work on virtually any species.
Yeah.
So decades ago, if you were going to, the most biological work was probably done on 6 or 7 species. It was done on E. coli bacteria and brewer's yeast and Arabidopsis and Drosophila, the fruit fly, and mice. Well, and part of that was because classical breeding techniques had been used on all of these creatures. Now we don't need to use classical breeding, and we can study organisms from the wild, and we can study things that no one studied before. So these genetic tools make accessible to us essentially the entire biosphere. And that's very powerful evolutionarily, that you're not restricted to just the 7 or 8 organisms that people have been working on for the most decades. You can, jump into something that no one has studied before and do, pretty sophisticated things.
What about speaking of sophisticated things? It just jumped in my mind the experiments of Jack Horner. So he wants to build, of course, he wants to build so-called chicken-o-raptor. No, it was what was
or a dino chicken, whatever you want to call
chicken,
it.
Something like that, like that. And he's pretty much on this way. So. Shall we have to expect something like mini Jurassic Park or mini velociraptor in our houses?
I think it's reasonable. Okay, I'm gonna just do something before I answer that question because of my age. I would say I cannot. It blows my mind what has happened in biology over the course of my career. The puzzles that were black boxes that nobody knew how to get into that have just been blown open. The genomes, we routinely sequence genomes of complex creatures, at the blink of an eye. So it's very hard to predict, except for the prediction that most things have gone faster and progress has been made faster than almost anyone predicts.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think you're going to see more and more resurrection of extinct features, whether they're the full creatures. But, people are working on like the extinct dodo, or people are working on trying to bring back the woolly mammoth. And just the challenge has to do with, well, just how much genetic information do we have about the extinct creature? And what surrogate can we use to sort of bring it back? Can we use modern elephants to help, gestate a woolly mammoth? I don't know what we're going to do about, dodos. We're going to have to find, some way to modify an egg and try to make a dodo. And then, if you want to make a more dinosaur-like bird, start with a chicken and start to work in these traits. And this may sound a bit like, a little like Jurassic Park, a little bit like scientists just being silly, but it's this exploration that often it necessitates the invention of new tools and things, and then those have wide uses. So I think sometimes these really hard problems of, bringing back an extinct species or whatever, we can get a little agitated of, oh, is this a good use of money and da. But usually it's just an idea, it's an inspiring idea that galvanizes a lot of thinking that then has its own sort of benefit. So there's a saying, I love it over here from I guess it was from a book done maybe in the 30s or something, like the usefulness of useless knowledge, right?
Yeah.
So some things may sound useless or may sound like scientists are sort of, off a little bit off the trail, but it so often spurs creativity and invention that becomes very widely useful. So yeah, I think there's going to be efforts to bring back extinct species or to bring back traits of extinct creatures in modern animals. I don't think we're going to do big, large-scale ecological experiments with these things. We got enough ecological concerns with everything that exists in the world. But I think we're exploring our ability to manipulate genes and generate traits, and I think that's probably going to wind up, being of medical use sooner rather than later.
What we are unique as a species because we can manipulate our own reproduction. When I taught my students about let's say development of mammals, I start the lecture with a question: what is the type of reproduction and what is the type of let's say insemination in mammals? And they say internal, of course. And I'm asking, okay, and what about external? No. Whoa, what about in vitro? So, okay,
Yeah.
so yes,
Yeah.
so we've gone so far, but if you have to, let's put it that way, if you have to update now endless forms most beautiful, what new discoveries or perspectives would you be excited to include, to put in?
Well, I think I would include some of these classic evolutionary mysteries that we now understand better, particularly the origins of structures.
Yeah.
Say something like the origin of the vertebrate limb that we now have a lot of, that's obviously a really important structure to us. Phenomena like mimicry, that we now have and it's rich. It's really beautiful. When you look under the hood at what's going on in mimicry, and again, you see, some of the same old genes doing new things, right? So it's something I think that I expressed in endless forms that we were beginning to see in those early days, that, invention is often a matter of teaching old genes new tricks. Well, we've seen a lot more examples of old genes learning new tricks. And that gives us, I think, a richer picture of where the, diversity of life comes from. So I think I would, just to make it still readable, I would pick some beautiful, fascinating phenomena around origins or mimicry, I would say. Maybe some examples of convergence as well. It's so fascinating to see independent lines of creatures arrive at a similar solution and to ask whether they took the same exact path or totally independent paths to that. So I think I would, those are classic mysteries that naturalists have wondered about for ages. And I think Evo Devo has shed light on them. That's what I'd pick.
Well, great idea. So I can't skip the question about astrobiology. What are the lessons from Evo Devo that can be applied in there? Because, you know, I still believe that within our lifespan, we will have to face the question of, let's say, not even encounter with the life outside of the borders of our planet, but at least with the fossil records of that life. And
Yeah.
I'm assuming those findings on the Jezero crater, also the future missions like Europa Clipper, like this Dragonfly mission, which hopefully will be sent to Titan. So
well, I think this is particularly, we'll get to the lessons of Evo Devo in a second, but just sort of say, for humanity, this would be one of the most exciting discoveries of all time. Is that I know that most scientists think there is life out there. In fact, some people may think, as I do, that it might be very abundant, widespread, microbial scale. I'm not saying it's all giraffes and redwood trees, but we've had, for all of humanity's existence, a very Earth-centric view of life, right? And we like to ponder the existence of life out there, but if we really confront its existence and its history, that's tremendously exciting. I think that the lessons of Evo Devo for astrobiology aren't really different than the lessons of evolutionary biology in general, which is, I think some of the rules of evolution are going to apply throughout the universe, in that if life is a form that replicates and there's variation in those replicating forms, then natural selection is going to operate. And there's going to be lineages, right? There's going to be ancestors and descendant relationships in that life. So much of what we've discovered about sort of the general rules of evolution, I think, are going to apply out there in the universe, and that we things will probably speciate, and things will have changed over time. And but I do expect that life is going to be more microbial, more cellular, as it was for the first 3 billion years on Earth. Visit Earth for most of its history, and life would be small and microbial. I think that's what we're going to find out there in the universe. And I hope, I would love to see really concrete evidence in my lifetime, because I think it would be one of the most exciting discoveries that humanity could ever make.